Aloha, everyone. So yeah, as Carly just said, what I'm going to do is talk to you a little bit about the expedition that we're going to have coming up, and a little bit about the motivation for it and some of the past work that we've been doing here in Hawaii. So the work with Schmidt Ocean Institute is an outgrowth of work that we've been doing with the Hawaii Undersea Research Lab at the University of Hawaii. And the focus is going to be on looking at sea level change in the past here in Hawaii, and using that to inform our understanding of sea level change for the future. So here in this picture, you're looking at a large coral head. That part of that picture is about 8 feet high. And this is at about 500 feet water depth. And that's a claw of a submersible. This happens to be a submersible that people go in, a manned submersible. And this grew in shallow water, just like the reef that we have here at Hanama. And then it was subsequently drowned as sea level rose as we came out of the last ice age. And so looking at how that sea level change happened here in Hawaii and comparing it to other places is part of how we understand sea level change and sea level vulnerability. And as it turns out, sea level doesn't change everywhere at the same rate on the planet when it's changing. It changes more in some places and less in other places, in part depending on where and how the ice that is melting to cause a sea level rise occurs. So I'm going to go through several different topics here and sort of laying the groundwork for why we're interested in this stuff, and then talking a little bit about what we've learned so far and then what we're planning to learn on the Falkor expeditions. You'll see lots of pictures in here, and these are all photographs that were taken out the window of a submarine. And the shallowest picture that you'll see is about 300 feet deep, and the deepest one's about 600 feet deep, and this is all too deep for scuba. So a lot of people, when they think about the Ice Age, they think about this, right? And a lot of the planet was like this in the Ice Age, cold and dry and icy, but not here in Hawaii. Okay, here in Hawaii, it was pretty much like it is today. Sea level was lower, the climate was a little bit drier, but it was tropical. And we know this from a lot of different lines of reasoning, but one of them is looking at pollen that's preserved in layered sediments that we can date. And so Hawaii had coral reefs back during the Ice Age. It has them now, and that gives us a link from the present back to the past, because we can look at modern coral reefs and learn a lot about what the environment was like when the old ones were forming. So this is just a couple of diagrams. They're kind of what we call an oblique view. In that upper diagram, you're looking at the islands, right? And the stuff that's poking above that blue plane is the stuff that's above sea level. I drew that blue flat plane in there, and that represents sea level. And all the stuff below that is the shape of the seafloor. The term we use for that is bathymetry. And so we're looking sort of up to the northwest from the south. And what you can see in that upper panel is the modern coastlines. Now, if you come down to this bottom diagram, you'll see this abbreviation a lot. LGM just stands for last glacial maximum, which kind of means the peak of the last ice age. So there's different estimates about how different sea level was at that time, but the average of them is about 130 meters, which is like 400 feet. So back at about 22,000 years ago, which is when that was, the islands look like that. And there's a couple things you can notice that are different. You can see these sort of wide apron around Kauai, for instance, and Oahu looks a little bit bigger on the south flank. But if you go one more volcano over, one more island, you look at Molokai, you see that huge peninsula. It's called Penguin Bank today. That whole thing was emergent. You also see that Lanai was connected to Maui, and the gap with Kaho'olawe and Maui was smaller. So that whole complex of islands, some people refer to it as Maui Nui. It was possible to get between the islands much more easily in those days than it is today. This is just a zoom in because Penguin Bank is a place we've been working in. It's a place we're going to continue to work with Schmidt, showing you the difference between what the island of Molokai looks like today and what it looked like back 22,000 years ago when it had that big peninsula above sea level. So one of the things we also know, just by observing sea level over the last couple of decades, it doesn't change the same everywhere. So we know sea level has been rising over the last century. And this is a map that shows you the Pacific and it's color-coded for rate. So it's not the amount, but it's the amount per unit time. And the red stuff is faster and the blue stuff is slower. And you can see that Hawaii is kind of in the middle. And there's several sort of complicated reasons why this happens. I'll get a little bit into it a little bit later, but part of this reflects things like weather patterns. The winds are blowing from east to west and they're piling up the ocean water on the west side of the ocean. It also has something to do with how the bottom of the ocean responds when we add water to it. It's flexible, and so it starts to bend and respond, and it changes shape. So this is a prediction of what, this is the windward side of the island. This is over in Waimanalo, what it will look like with about 3 feet of sea level rise, which is a very conservative estimate for the end of the century. And all the stuff that's in red is water. And so not only does sea level rise, and that causes shorelines to move inward, but also groundwater, which tends to float on top of saltier water beneath it. When the sea level rises, it pushes the groundwater up and out of the ground. And so this is just a typical inundation map. And understanding for us in Hawaii, is it going to change by 3 feet or 2 feet or 5 feet, is one of the primary motivations of our research, because we can look back in time and see, well, how much did it change in Hawaii compared to other places? So this is another kind of technical diagram, but there's two different maps of the world there. And what they show you is a prediction. It's a model of how much they think sea level is going to change in the next, by the end of the century. And it's color-coded again, so red means a lot, and the cooler colors means a little bit. And there's two different scenarios. The upper one is conservative, and the bottom one is more extreme. And in the bottom one, the biggest areas of sea level and change, and Hawaii's in it, have a fair amount of change. It's 2.5 feet. And those differences, you know, why we see some places that are yellow and some places are blue, come from the exact kinds of studies like we're going to be doing here in Hawaii over the next month and a half, which is looking at historical records of sea level change and how it varies from place to place. So this is the kind of stuff we want to understand about this big change in sea level. It was much greater amount of sea level change than we predict to happen over the next few hundred years, but we want to understand how and when and what are the rates and how does it vary from place to place and what are the coastal impacts and what are the ecological impacts on coral reef structure. All of those things are our motivations. And so this is what we do when we do this research. I realize it's kind of a boring slide, but we go out and we map the seabed. We map it in various resolutions and we find the stuff that looks like it should have a coral reef there or had a coral reef when it was shallow. Then we go out there with a submersible of one kind or another, and we take video and we take photographs and we take specimens. And these are now skeletal corals, meaning they're dead. They're not alive anymore. They were alive and then drowned as sea level rose. We bring them back to the lab. We determine their age. And then we do a detailed analysis of the variation of age, the types of corals, what the seabed looks like, and that gives us a kind of a holistic understanding of how that coral reef formed and how it responded as sea level was rising. So just a couple pictures. This is another photograph out the window, again about around 500 feet deep. That's a coral that grew in maybe 20 feet of water. And I want to show you some of the tools that we use. So there's several different kinds. There's submersibles, and a lot of the photos and images I'm going to show you now come from a work that we've done in our manned submersibles. They have some positive attributes, but some of the negative attributes are they're closed quarters, they're cramped, you can't spend very long down there. Only a couple people can go down and make the observations. So we'll be using a remote operated vehicle with Schmidt Ocean Institute. And that vehicle looks like this. And so this one, the people don't go down in it. Instead, they sit in the control room. There's some pilots, and they never let the scientists touch any of the cool stuff. And whether you're in the sub or in the ROV, the pilots control everything. You just get to say, I would please like a sample of that thing over there, and then you point to it. And so this is the modern way. Much more research on the seafloor is being done this way than with manned submersibles. So this is sort of the wave of the future. Another tool we're going to be using is called an AUV. It stands for Autonomous Underwater Vehicle. It's a robot, and it's programmed on the ship. It goes down, and we tell it something about the terrain it's going to see, and then it drives along, and it takes photographs, and it makes very, very high-resolution maps so that we can identify things the size of an apple. on the seafloor. And so we're going to use those kinds of maps. We're going to collect data across most of Penguin Bank up on the upcoming Falkor expedition and tie all of our visual observations to it and our dating and everything else, and hopefully understand that entire reef system. It's a very big one, and be able to say something about how it changed over time and what kind of corals are present and everything else. We also bring stuff home to the lab, and we make, this is how we determine the dating. We dissolve up the coral specimens, we separate out a couple elements called thorium and uranium, and we measure them on some mass spectrometers. And we have all the stuff at the University of Hawaii, so this makes this a good place to do this work. Okay, so some background. Why do we really want to do this? So how many of you are familiar with the fact that over the last couple million years, the climate on Earth has changed a lot, back and forth? It's like a seesaw. Excellent. I'm glad to hear. So there's three things that kind of happen in concert with each other. And every time sea level goes from being high and we're in a warm climate to then going to a sea level low and we're in a cold climate, it's a little bit different every time. There are no two of these cycles is exactly the same, but these are the kinds of things that take place. There are changes in the level of the ocean. There are changes in the way the oceans circulate, which transports a lot of the heat on the planet and controls where we do and don't have storms. And there's changes in the climate on the continents. And these things work together to give us these climate signals, and we have what we call proxy records of those that tell us something about how much ice volume, where were the currents doing what, and what was the climate like on the land. So this is an example of one kind of record. That's a drill core into some ice. And ice in the Greenland ice sheet, and what happens in the high polar regions is that it gets a slightly different density of ice in the winter and the summer, so you can count the bands and you can count back the time. It also turns out that all the ice that we have as ice sheets and glaciers comes out of the ocean. The water that made it comes from the ocean. And in cold times, we grow these ice sheets and we take water out of the ocean, sea level goes down. And in warm times, all that ice melts again and it goes back into the ocean. This has been happening, like I say, for the last few million years. And it turns out that there's a couple of different flavors of water. One of the flavors of water has something called oxygen 18. It's a heavy variety of oxygen. And that preferentially goes into the water that gets into the ice sheet. And so by looking at the variations in the isotopes, we can say something about what volume of water was taken out of the oceans. People also look in marine sediments. These are good because they go back a lot farther in time than the ice sheets. And they have these sort of anti-correlated, just meaning sort of opposite sense of signatures. When one of them is high, the other one is low. And people have been able to use this to reconstruct global climate. And this is a fancy way of presenting it. There's time across the bottom there on the horizontal. And there's this delta 18O. You can just read that as temperature. It's not the exact temperature number, but when it's high, like where I have the red circle, that's a warm time. And when that number's low, it's a cold time. So you can see the zigzaggy pattern. The zigs and zags are more intense now than they were a million years ago. So this is a condition on Earth that has been changing over time, and our climate system is in a relatively what we call twitchy condition. It changes a lot. Another thing you might notice is a little bit hard for me to point out on here, but when we come from a warm period into a cold period, we do it kind of slowly. There's a sawtooth pattern. And then we bounce back from a cold period to a warm period really fast. So I'm going to take the very last climate cycle there and show it to you in detail. And this is what it looks like. We come down from a warm into a cold. That LGM, again, that's the maximum of the last ice age glaciation. And then we bounce back really quickly. And there's all these little spikes that have to do with all of the interrelationships of all the things that control climate. But even that coming back from cold to warm has some spikes in it too. They don't show up at this scale, but those are things we're really interested in because those are things that tell us about how and where ice melts. So this is the coming back. And this is a funny diagram because it starts with today over there, and coming closer to me is time in the past. So you could read this if you wanted to read it as like walking forward in time, you'd start over here and go that way. Or if you want to think about it as looking back into the past, you'd start on the other side. But what we know is that global sea level has been rising, and it hasn't been rising in a constant rate. And the changes in the rate have to do with pulses of water that melts from the ice sheets. There's a lot of debate about what causes these pulses. I'll talk about some of the possibilities in a moment. But there are periods of time where we warm very quickly and we can have a lot of sea level rise, meaning 400, 500 feet in just 200-300 years. And then we have other periods of time where it doesn't change very much. So understanding those changes, those things that happen on human timescales, those things that mimic what could happen for us over the next 100 years is a very important and active area of research around the planet. These are just summaries of them. I'm going to skip through them because they're not important and just show you a little video here of what's called the Cordilleran Ice Sheet. It's the ice sheet that sat on North America as it was melting. And it happens very quickly, but one thing you can see is that as it starts to melt, it leaves in its wake some water. And some of that water gets trapped behind the ice sheet until it gets small enough and then it gets released into the ocean. And this is one of the hypothesized causes of these large, fast meltwater pulses. Is all of a sudden a bunch of water being released into the ocean and causing sea level rise. And it turns out that if you're close to this ice, sea level changes a lot. And if you're far from this ice, like down near Antarctica, it doesn't change by as much. So depending on where the sea level is changing and how much it changes from place to place, we can reconstruct where the ice was melting. This is an example of someone running a model that says, for that scenario that we're just looking at in that video, where do we expect to see the most sea level change and how will it redistribute itself on the planet? And because of a combination of factors, there's the water that gets added to the ocean from the melting, but there's also the fact that the land that was under the ice, when you take the ice off it, it starts to come up, it starts to rebound. So that starts to counteract sea level change, so that in the areas that are close to where the glacier was melting, we see, in a net sense, less sea level change than we see farther away. This is another model of melting in the southern hemisphere, which is a place that we're acutely watching now because the western Antarctic ice sheet appears to start showing some breaking up on its edges, and people have hypothesized that this happened in the past also and caused one of those meltwater pulses. So this is a compilation diagram. This is another map showing you at the peak of the Ice Age, and 11,000 years ago is the start of a period, a geological period we like to call the Holocene. That's when the Ice Age was over and we went into a period of relatively warm and stable climate, which we've been in for the last 11,000 years, minus the last 200 years, which has been changing a lot. You see two kinds of things on this diagram. One is the temperature of the ocean, those are in the blue colors, and the other one is how wet was it on the land. And it's a little bit hard to pull out the differences, but one thing that you see is that during the Ice Age, it was drier on the land and a little bit cooler in the oceans than today, and the sea level was lower. You don't see the sea level on that diagram. But one thing we know is that the sea level doesn't change in the same way in each place. So this is just, again, maybe a little bit too technical for this talk, but if we go to 3 different places where we have coral reefs and we can look at them, and this is work that's been done by others, and do something similar to what we've done here and look at how sea level changed at that place and compare them, we find that at the same time sea level wasn't the same level in each of those places. What it means is that we have to think about a relative sea level change at each place we're looking at, because it isn't relevant to know how sea level changed in Barbados if we care about how sea level is going to change in Hawaii. This is another kind of diagram showing you again for all the different places that contributed to sea level change in the last 20,000 years, how much of it came from different places and how that's represented on a map. Unfortunately, we don't know the exact sequence. We don't know that all of the ice in all those places melted at the same rate or even at the same time. And so this is something that part of our work is trying to figure out. So this is some of the reasons why the sea level doesn't just change like a bathtub when ice melts. The ice that builds up on the land during ice ages pushes down on the land. And when we melt that ice off, that land slowly comes up. Scandinavia is still coming up today from 20,000 years ago of melting. We also, the ice that sits on the land, it has a gravitational attraction. It pulls water to it. So next to an ice sheet, sea level is relatively high. And as that sea level melts, that gravitational attraction goes away and the sea level relaxes close in to the ice sheet to something lower. But at the same time, there's deformation of the seabed. And the seabed is connected to a thick part, the upper part of the earth that we call the lithosphere, is very, very viscous. It means it deforms very slowly. So that even though one would expect it to respond quickly if it was a material that was something of low viscosity. It takes some time. And so it's the relationship between the time period of melting, the time period of how the land masses go up and down, and this gravitational attraction that causes all these variations, local variations around the planet. And we understand the physics at a very basic level, but not at a level where we could predict it, where we could say, oh, well, let's just go to Key West and we'll be able to say how sea level is changing, or let's go to the Big Island. We can't do that. We need to make observations at different places and then tune these models of global sea level to understand those kinds of things. And that's a main motivation for our work. So it turns out that if people have these models, and there's a bunch of competing models, it's just one example, but if you look at how much sea level has changed in an absolute sense, taking all these various factors together, since the last peak, you can see that it's not the same everywhere. Those places in red, it's changed a lot. The places in blue, it hasn't changed very much. And I circled on that map Hawaii, because Hawaii is a place where it changed very little. And this is not absolute change. This is kind of relative change compared to something we call eustatic, which is the sort of bathtub change. So Hawaii is a great place to study because it's not affected by a lot of these other factors that I just mentioned. A lot of the previous studies, and they're circled there in white, happen in places where there's a lot of correction that needs to be made to the data because of these other factors. And it's amazing to me that someone hasn't tried to do this work in Hawaii because we don't have to worry about that stuff. It's easier, and I like easy. This also shows you again, even if we just look at change since about 5,000 years ago, we're in a place that's about zero. And you can boil it down to looking in these diagrams off on the right, show you really small amounts of change. And again, Hawaii is in one of these places we call a sweet spot, where there's very little change from these complicating factors. So there's yet another complication which makes sea level change differently in different places. And this has to do with how and when did ice melt on the planet coming out of the last ice age. There's two groups, one at the Australian National University and one at the University of Toronto, and they don't agree at all on how this happened. Both of them can make models, and they can force their data to go through places where we have observations, like here in Hawaii and elsewhere, and then they make guesses about the rest of it. And so more data will, of course, make them better. And these are models for different scenarios, and the main difference between them is that the ANU model, ice melting happens kind of slowly for the first 5,000 years after the start of what we call the deglaciation, and the Toronto model is more quickly. And it goes more quickly. And when we look at how those compare in Hawaii, we can see that they make a big difference in when this meltwater pulse thing, when they would say it would happen. Now, we've dated it, and we know when it happened, and we know that our data, currently fit the ANU model a lot better than the Toronto model, but we have a lot more work to do to sort of convince ourselves that we're right. So this leads us to the sort of final bit of motivation, which is people have taken this information, it's still imperfect, but it's better than nothing, about how ice melted in the past, and they've used it to predict how ice might melt in the future. So inform our understanding of climate change moving forward. And this gives us the idea of what we call meltwater fingerprints. So if a lot of melting happens in Antarctica, we're going to see the pattern like we see in the bottom diagram. And if a lot of melting happens in the northern hemisphere, we'd see a pattern around the world of sea level change that looks like the upper diagram. And if it's something in between, we'd see something in between. But this is how the data that we are collecting and others have collected in the past go to inform our understanding of future change. Okay, so this is another video sort of showing you in a little bit more detail what happened to the continental ice sheet over North America. And you can see the time when this is happening. You see little lobes kind of get smaller and then advance again. They're sort of peeling back. The Great Lakes form. And there's these big bodies of water that are stored behind that ice sheet. And eventually that stuff gets added into the oceans at intervals. And these are the things that cause these, that we believe cause these meltwater pulses. But the data that constrain that are really, really limited. So we have places that are close to where the glaciers were, where we can look at different kinds of records where when a place goes from having ice on it to not having ice on it, you get certain kinds of deposits, geological deposits, like peat, which is a sort of like coal. But the best sort of gold standard sites are places where we can look at coral reefs, like the ones that we have here in Hawaii that haven't been looked at. But a couple of other sites have, and they're the ones that help us understand how sea level changes in response to that ice melt I just showed you. And these are the three main sites that have been studied before. Each one of them, if we compare them to those diagrams I was showing you of all of these complicating effects of how sea level varies from place to place because of gravity and what we call ice rebound, they're all in bad places. You know, I didn't overlay them on that other map. Hawaii's in a good place, and Hawaii doesn't have a red circle around it because we haven't done that much work there yet. But we can go to some of these other places. So Papua New Guinea, there's a place called the Huon Peninsula. This is a place where the land is rising up very quickly. And it doesn't really matter why it's rising up quickly, but the coral reefs that were deposited during the last ice age, they're above sea level. We can go walk around them. We can get a really, really precise idea of the age of when they formed. But we don't really know what depth they formed in, right? We have to guess how fast the land's been coming up. And so it's a good place to learn something about timing, but a bad place to learn something about sea level. Anyway, people have done a reconstruction there, and it's one of the ones that we use. Another place, one of the other big reconstructions, is in Tahiti. Tahiti is a place where the island is relatively stable. It's not going up or down. And so they drilled a bunch of holes there in the ocean drilling project, and they dated the coral. They drilled into the coral reefs, and they dated them, and they've kind of come up with a reconstruction. It looks like this. Each one of those lines is a different coral core. It doesn't really matter too much the details, but they've come up with another reconstruction. The difficulty with this place is that we don't have any sea level indicator because the corals are buried underneath other corals. So that brings us to our Hawaii site. We have a place, and this is Penguin Bank, so you can see in the little box there off of Molokai, where the land isn't going up or down. It's where it was when sea level was rising through it, and the coral reef is there for us to go look at. It's drowned, it's dead now. But it's still there in the place that it formed, and all the corals are present, and we can study them and learn a lot about them. So these are some maps of the seafloor, the different colors. The warm colors are more shallow, and the darker colors are deeper. And these are structures. This is all coral reef. It's equivalent to something like Great Barrier Reef. So this is an oblique view. It's a 3D representation, and you can see some lines. I put 3 of our dive tracks. And just to give you an idea, that little cone that you see I've written next to it, 750 feet. That's about, it's a little bit smaller, but it's about the same size as Coco Crater, just over here across the road. So these are big features. They're covered with coral. We can dive on them. And as you would expect, the deeper we go, the older the coral, because they were formed as sea level was coming up. So the shallower we are, the younger the coral. These are some more maps sort of showing you what the dives look like on that landscape, and some pictures of what it looks like when we go down there in the sub. So those are pictures of, you know, coral that is now dead. There's other things growing on top of it, something we call coral and algae, for instance. We can take samples of that stuff. We can see from the coral morphology what species it was, what condition it grew in. You know, was it close to the wave base? Was it very deep compared to where the waves are? And use that to reconstruct the conditions. We've also done some work right off the coast here. And you know, the volcanic feature that we're on extends out underwater, and it was formed about 80,000 years ago. And as sea level rose up over it, it also deposited corals. And these are a couple of dive tracks that we ran just outside of the bay. And we're going to be coming back here with the Schmidt, with the Falkor, and with what's something called the Remus AUV, and we're going to map this in great detail to be able to put some interpretations on those dive observations. We're also going to go down to the Line Islands, to Kingman and Palmyra. These are U.S. holdings. They're about 1,000 miles from here. They're small islands, and part of the motivation for going to this place is by seeing the difference in what we see between here and Hawaii, and comparing that to Tahiti, we'll be able to understand something about whether more of the melting during this period of time happened from Antarctica or happened from Greenland, and that's an important question to answer. So this is what the stuff looks like, that we sample it with a claw. Again, the pilot does it, the scientists just sit there. And then we bring it up on the ship, and we find the material that looks like good coral, and we chemically prepare it in certain ways to kill anything that might be living on it. And then we drill out little bits of it, and we take that into the lab, and we analyze it, and we determine how old it is. And this is what some of the stuff looks like. So that's a huge single coral head. that's almost 30 feet high, 10 meters. This grew in a condition at about 150 meters water depth today, but it was probably growing in about 10 meters or about 30 feet when it grew at a time when coral reef growth was very optimal. We don't have these conditions in Hawaii today, but if we go to the Western Pacific, we can find these conditions. So in fact, even though one might think that, oh, in the Ice Age it was cold and coral reef accretion wasn't very good here, it's the opposite. It was actually better during the last Ice Age. And part of this has to do with the fact that it was windier during the Ice Age. There was a lot of wind-blown dust, and a lot of that dust provides nutrients to the water that help corals grow. And this is just some other pretty pictures of what the corals look like. We see a whole range of types, species, what we call morphologies, the shapes that tell us something about the conditions that they grew in. These are some modern analogs. These are what those same corals look like today in the modern environment. And we can make a comparison between those two by going to what we call an analog site. So it's just adjacent to our Penguin Bank site. Chip Fletcher, who's one of my colleagues working on this project, did a study off of the south side of Molokai looking at the modern reef that's there today and how it relates to the conditions in the ocean, things like how clear is the water, how warm is the water, what's the wave regime like, and going back into time for the last 5,000 years. And what they've done is been able to show that depending on where you are, which site, and how deep you are, you get different corals. You get different proportions of different species. And so we can use this information at our site to say what the conditions were like at different parts of our site when it was forming. There's also a sequence of events that happens after a coral dies and sea level keeps going up over it. We start to get other organisms that grow on it. Some of you may have heard this. It's a hot term now in the science community. It's called mesophotic. It means just a little bit. Sometimes people call it the twilight zone. It's places where there's not very much light, but there are still some kinds of organisms that can do photosynthesis that grow on top of the corals. They also give us depth information. And so we'll be collecting that information as well, and it tells us something about the rate at which sea level change. So from all this information, we can put together a model, what geologists like to call stratigraphy, which is basically just the sequence of events. We also talk about something called facies, which are a fancy way of saying conditions. And so we have a general understanding already at this site, which from a couple of places that we've been with a sub, which now we want to translate to this whole 10-mile by about 3-mile rectangle of Penguin Bank to understand the entire reef. And whether or not this sequence of events happens everywhere or how it varies from place to place. So now let me just show you a little bit about what sea level, what we already know about changes there. So this is the Penguin Bank site. That yellow thing is the bathymetry with no water on it. And then what I've done is put a little flat plane of water on there for different sea levels at different periods of time. And it's a little bit hard to see in this snapshot, so I can show you a sequence, but we can see how sea level changed, and it doesn't change uniformly across this feature. So if we start back during the Ice Age, we see this, it's a lagoon. There's a small amount of land that's sticking out above sea level at the forereef, and this makes it a very calm environment. It's part of what contributed to having those huge coral beds. As we come forward in time, that thing starts to drown. So now we've come forward in time a couple thousand years. We come another couple thousand years, and that thing is drowned a lot. And the other thing that you'll notice is that a lot of the landscape that's at the sort of upper part of the diagram has flooded. I'll go back and show you that. You can see all that flooding that happens. That's starting to cover, and there's more flooding, and of course, ultimately, this whole thing will be flooded. I didn't go with the whole sequence of events till today, but the rate of change of sea level and the change in these features, we see those little mounds that are still sticking up, those form that way because of how sea level was changing at the time. And so that's something that we want to understand better. What we already know, and there's been some debate about this in other sites where the record isn't so complete, we know that the coral reef can keep up with sea level change. The coral doesn't stop growing when sea level rises, even when it rises a lot, at least here in Hawaii. So that's something that's a good thing, but it does change. It changes what it looks like. It changes what species are there. And this is something that we're hoping to get a better handle on moving forward. So I just a couple more slides I wanted to end up. So I wanted to say thank you to HURL, the Hawaii Undersea Research Group, that we've done a lot of this preliminary work with. That's a picture of their sub and the KOK. And of course, the Schmidt Ocean Institute, and our work with them is coming up. And so we'll have a lot more to report about 6 weeks from now. But that's the picture of their ROV, that's a picture of the control room, that's the picture of the ship. And in fact, the first thing we're going to do when we go out of the harbor on August 25th is come here and park the ship off Hanauma Bay for a couple of days and do some mapping. And so hopefully the ship will be visible from here. And if you see us out there, you know, don't think we're out there fishing or contaminating the water, whatever. We're just making some observations of the seafloor and hopefully learning some interesting stuff. So I'll just, you know, conclude that we're using robots and some human presence in the sea to understand sea level change. And we do this by looking at corals and coral reefs that we knew grew in certain conditions of sea level. We learn about the time that they formed, and that gives us the ability to reconstruct the past. We'll use that information to say something about what we think will happen in the future here in Hawaii. So listening, I hope this wasn't too technical, but I'm happy to take any kind of questions. Yes, please, shout out.
Are you considering chemical changes like CO2, which may be more prevalent today?
Yeah, so there are definitely changes in water chemistry. CO2 probably affects the calcification rate, the rate at which the coral skeleton grows, but it's probably a secondary factor. One of the questions that we have, and this is an area of active research, not of my own, but of other people's, is understanding how does changes in CO2 affect the structure of the community that exists on a coral reef, meaning are some species of corals more favored when the when CO2 is high? And this is something that we don't have a very good handle on yet. It's not something that you can easily, you know, measure from the coral. You can't determine what the past CO2 was, but there are other reconstructions, and certainly we'll compare our observations to that and see if a trend falls out. But we don't really expect that to be a big factor. Other questions? Yes.
Rise then, and so why would we be in North America affected by the changes that are going on with sea levels and stuff? If we're higher than we were 40 million years ago.
Yeah, so it's a great question, and there's a couple of different ways to answer it. One is to say that if you're anywhere but the coast, sea level change isn't going to really affect you. But if you're at the coast, it will. And one of the interesting things we know is that even over the last several thousand years, we can still see that sea level is still changing as we go down the coast from, up in Labrador, and we come down into Maine, and then down into the Mid-Atlantic region and down to Key West. We see that there's still a slow response where the land is coming up due to this factor of the ice melting, and it takes that long. And so if you go, the farther north you go, the more it's happening because the more ice there was present. And so it's not a huge amount of change. It's probably amounts to something like a foot of difference in the last 1,000 years. How much it's been changing, but it's a factor. One way to think of it. Another way to think of it is that when we put a lot of ice on the land, we change the climate of the planet. And so the places where we see storm belts move further south when we put ice on the land, we get drier conditions over the continents, and the oceans circulate differently. So all the stuff that depends on that, where we find fish, the fish that we use to eat, how weather systems are formed in the oceans due to the circulations of the surface oceans, all that stuff changes. So that as that meltwater comes off the land and goes into the oceans, it changes everything about this related system that controls our climate and our food sources from the ocean. So they're all very, very tightly linked. Those, I guess, are the reasons why I would care, regardless of where you live. Yes?
one of the things you said earlier is that the water that is in the ice, especially in the Arctic and Antarctic, all comes from the ocean, right? But when you also talk about the climate, it's dry and cool, or wet and warm. So is that sort of difference due to the greenhouse gas effect of water vapor being in the air? You know what I'm saying? It sounds like there are a couple cycles that, even though they're related, are also pretty separate. Does that make sense?
Yes, yeah, it's another great question, and it is. There's something that we call positive feedbacks, and so not only water vapor, but also carbon dioxide and methane. When we're in a glacial world, the concentrations of all those gases in the atmosphere are really low for slightly different reasons, but there are changes that happen in what we call the biogeochemical cycles, which are the way in which carbon dioxide and oxygen are produced and consumed in both land plants and in marine plants, especially the small microscopic organisms that we call plankton. How much, the patterns of where they grow, how they grow, and how much carbon dioxide they consume or produce, and how much oxygen they consume and produce. Those things are dramatically affected by the sort of changes in ocean circulation and ocean shape as sea level changes. So that one of the things that we find is that in the climate system, it looks like the thing that causes ice to melt, which has to do with how the sun orbits, how the Earth orbits the sun, and sometimes we're pointing more towards the sun and sometimes less, and so that heats the planet differently. That happens first, and it causes a chain of events that then start to put more water vapor in the atmosphere, and that magnifies the effect. And this is one of the parts of we understand how the natural system works pretty well, but we don't understand the human-induced system very well. There are things that we're doing to our atmosphere that contribute to greenhouse gases, but we're also doing things that contribute to cooling. We're putting a lot of black soot in the atmosphere, things that reflect light back into space. And so there's some complicated interplays that go into making some of the predictions for the future a little bit complicated. But yeah, there are a lot of things that are related together, which makes it a fascinating scientific problem, but easy for people who are skeptical about it to poke holes in the details of our understanding. Yeah, Carly.
Yeah, I just also wanted to draw attention to the fact that the second leg of this cruise, which is in the middle of September, will be with ROV Sebastian, which was shown up on the slide earlier. That ROV is brand new to Schmidt Ocean Institute. This will be the second science cruise that will be using the ROV. Cool. And all of the dives that we do are live streamed. So you can go onto the Schmidt Ocean YouTube page and watch in real time as Ken is speaking with the ROV pilot and telling them where to go to get a chance to see some of these underwater features that Ken's been talking about today.
Yes.
You will be able, so the audio isn't on all the time, but we'll do updates on the hour, and for about 1 hour of every dive, we'll advertise when that's going to be. You'll have Ken live answering questions and talking to the pilots. You'll be able to listen in. It's kind of cool because you're actually on the ship.
If you've never seen video of the seafloor, it's mesmerizing. It's really a fantastic thing, especially when the vehicle, whether it's a sub or an ROV, when you first get to a site, there'll be fish that have been sort of hanging out there, and they all sort of come up out of the pukas in the seabed, and yeah, it's mesmerizing. It's a really beautiful thing to witness. Yes.
Yeah, I tend to think of the progression with the islands as being primarily erosion. Is there any erosion involved in your looking back in the past, or is it once it's underwater, don't worry about it?
It's another excellent question. So there's several different kinds of erosion, and there is a kind of erosion that can happen even when things are underwater. And it's likely that some of the features on the top of Penguin Bank have been affected by currents, redistribution of material, some erosion. We have some evidence that there's some freshwater seeps, so fresh water that's somehow migrated through the ground, offshore from Molokai, and then it comes up. And that does some kind of erosion. It makes something that we call karst, which makes caves and caverns. So we see some of that. But at least in the small number of places that we've been able to visually observe, the seabed is formed entirely of coral skeleton that grew in place. So I think we know that there was probably some erosion happening too. So what we're really looking at is the net effect of those things, but without sort of being able to peel off the coral, we don't really know how much erosion was happening.